Everyone laughed when Evan Cole raised his hand at the auction, paying just $1 for a starving, trembling horse no one wanted. They called him a fool, certain the animal was worthless. But as days turned into months, whispers spread across the valley. Something extraordinary was happening on his ranch. And when the truth finally came to light, the entire town was left speechless. The air smelled of dust and livestock as the old loudspeaker crackled above the fairground pens. It was a late spring morning in Paradise Valley, Montana, the kind where the mountains held on to a crown of snow even while the fields below were waking to green. Evan Cole stood at the edge of the wooden arena, hat brim pulled low, boots chalked with the white grit of the gravel lot. He had come because Sheriff Tom insisted he might find a bargain. Maybe a mule, maybe some tack left behind by a rancher too old to keep going. What he didn't expect was the silence that settled over him when they dragged out the gray horse. The animal was little more than bone and hide, ribs sharp under a patchy coat, eyes rimmed with fear that never stilled. Its mane hung like wet rope, and a thin scar crossed the corner of its mouth where a harsh bit had once rested. The auctioneer coughed into the microphone, his voice echoing in hollow enthusiasm. "Lot 27, broke gelding. Any takers to start at 200? Nobody raised a hand. A boy in the crowd laughed, whispering to his father, "That thing's already half in the ground." The father chuckled, shaking his head. Murmurs rippled, some mocking, some pitying, most already turning away. Evan's chest tightened. He remembered the nights after his father's accident, the silence in the barn, the empty stall no one dared to fill. He remembered the way neighbors had muttered, "The Coles aren't what they used to be." Their voices still clung to him, even now, years later. The auctioneer tried again. 150? The silence thickened. The horse shifted, nearly stumbling, as if the weight of being unwanted pressed it down. Something in Evan's gut twisted. He thought of his daughter Maya's drawings, bright wings on ordinary animals, paper tacked above her bed in Boise, where she lived with her mother. Maya always gave every creature a second chance. Evan's own voice surprised him as it cut through the dust and laughter. $1. The words hung absurdly in the air. For a heartbeat, the entire fairground froze. Then laughter broke like a sudden wind. A rancher slapped his knee. A group of teenagers hooted. Even the auctioneer smirked, raising his brow. "Well, we have a $1 bid." He tapped the gavel on the block. "Sold to the gentleman in the hat." The gavel's strike echoed louder than it should have. The horse flinched at the sound, eyes wide, nostrils flaring. Evan lowered his gaze, feeling the heat of mockery burn the back of his neck. Whispers and chuckles followed him as he signed the paper and was handed the rope. He stepped forward. The horse balked, hooves scuffing at the packed earth. Evan tightened his grip, but not too much. He had no plan, no training, just a pull in his chest that said leaving it behind would be worse than making a fool of himself. "Come on, fella," he muttered, voice low, steady. "We'll figure it out." The horse jerked once more, then hesitated, ears flicking as though trying to catch a sound too quiet for the crowd. With an uneasy breath, it followed him toward the waiting trailer. Behind them, the laughter trailed off into scattered murmurs, some mocking, some uneasy, none believing this match would last a week. Evan closed the trailer door and leaned his forehead against the cool metal. He let out a long breath, tasting the dust, the doubt, the strange spark of defiance, For a single dollar, he had bought himself not just a broken horse, but a story everyone in town was already betting against. The sheriff's voice called after him from across the lot, half teasing, half warning. "You'll regret this, Cole. Some things can't be fixed." Evan turned, his jaw tight. "Then I guess we'll see." And with that, he climbed into his truck, the trailer rattling behind, carrying a shadow of bones and scars toward a farm already worn thin by debt and memory. Yet somewhere beneath the laughter, in the quiet place no one else could hear, a whisper seemed to stir. The road home wound along the river, cottonwoods bending under the spring wind, their leaves flashing pale like fish scales in the light. Evan drove with one hand on the wheel, the other resting on the worn gear shift, his jaw clenched as the trailer rattled behind him. Inside, the horse shifted nervously. Every bump on the gravel made the axles groan, and every groan made the animal lurch. By the time the ranch gate came into view, the sky had turned the color of pewter, heavy with the promise of rain. The Cole Ranch looked tired, fences sagging, the barn leaning slightly as if weary of standing, grass patchy from years of drought. Evan pulled the truck up beside the barn and killed the engine. For a long moment, he sat still, hands gripping the wheel as if letting go would mean facing not just the horse, but every mistake that clung to him. The voices of the auction still rang in his ears, laughter that smelled of ridicule more than humor. When he opened the trailer door, the horse's head shot up, nostrils flaring. Its sides quivered, damp with sweat, though the ride hadn't been long. Evan kept his voice low. "Easy, boy. Just the two of us now." He eased the rope forward. The gelding stamped once, hesitated, then stepped down, the boards groaning under his weight. His ribs showed with every movement, but there was a wary strength beneath the weakness, like a spring coiled too tight. The stall Evan had cleared was little more than a corner patched with fresh straw, the walls nailed together from old timber. He'd built it that morning on impulse, as though somewhere deep down he'd known he wouldn't come home alone. The boards creaked in the wind, but it was shelter of a kind. Whisper paused at the threshold, eyes rolling white at the shadows inside. Evan tugged gently, then let the rope slacken, giving space. After a long pause, the horse stepped in, ears flicking, tail twitching nervously. The first raindrops hit the tin roof, a soft drumming that grew heavier by the minute. Evan closed the gate, sliding the latch with a sigh. Water streaked down his hat brim. He leaned against the stall, listening to the storm gather strength. Inside, Whisper circled once, then stood facing the far wall, body taut as wire. Lightning cracked across the valley. The gelding bolted against the boards, rattling the nails. Evan rushed forward, palms out, speaking softly, though his heart hammered. "Steady, steady now. You're not out there anymore. You're here." His voice nearly drowned under the pounding rain, yet he kept talking. Words barely more than breath. The horse trembled, hooves striking sparks against the planks, then stilled just enough to listen. Hours passed that way, man and animal caught in the rhythm of the storm. Evan's back ached from standing, his hands raw from gripping the rope loosely enough to give slack yet firmly enough to anchor. Each time the thunder rolled, Whisper shied, but each time the gap between panic and stillness grew shorter. Evan marked those small victories silently, storing them like embers against the cold that seemed to seep from the walls of memory. When at last the rain slowed, Evan sank onto an overturned bucket, exhaustion washing over him. His shirt clung to his skin, damp with sweat and rain. Whisper lowered his head slightly, the tension in his neck easing, though his ears never stopped swiveling. Evan studied him in the dim light, wondering what ghosts haunted those eyes. He had no answer, only the faint knowledge that the horse's fear mirrored his own, an unease that had lived in him since the day his father fell. The wind pushed through the cracks in the barn, carrying the smell of wet earth. Evan drew in a long breath. "Guess we're stuck with each other," he murmured. The horse flicked an ear, but didn't shy away. That tiny concession was enough to make Evan straighten, his chest lifting against the weight pressing down on him. Outside, the storm broke apart, stars pricking the sky one by one. Evan rose, muscles stiff, and checked the latch again before leaving. He paused at the barn door, glancing back. Whisper stood in the straw, head lowered, shadows softening the hard lines of his ribs. For the first time since the gavel fell, Evan felt the echo of something like hope. When he stepped into the night, Sheriff Tom's voice drifted back to him, a memory from the auction lot. Some things can't be fixed. Evan pulled his collar tight against the chill. Maybe, he whispered to himself, but maybe some things aren't broken the way folks think. The wind carried the words across the dark pasture, and behind him, in the stall patched together from old boards, the gray horse let out a low, uncertain sigh. Morning broke with a pale wash of sunlight across the valley, the fields glistening from the storm that had raged through the night. The barn smelled of wet hay and old wood, and Evan's eyes stung with the grit of too little sleep. He had spent most of the night dozing on a stool outside the stall, ears alert to every shuffle of hooves. Whisper had finally quieted near dawn, though the horse still refused to look directly at him. Evan was brushing the mud off his boots when the sound of tires crunching over gravel reached his ears. He stepped out, blinking against the sun, and saw a small white truck pulling into the yard, a green veterinary emblem stenciled on the door. Out stepped Lena Ruiz, dark hair pulled back in a neat braid, her boots clean, her eyes sharp with the confidence of someone who had seen more than her years suggested. She carried a canvas bag that clinked faintly with metal instruments. "You're Evan Cole?" she asked, her tone steady but not unfriendly. "Yeah. Sheriff send you?" Evan wiped his hands on his jeans, embarrassed at the state of the place, the sagging porch, the peeling paint, the fences crying out for mending. "He did," she said. "He thought you could use an extra set of eyes on that horse." Evan hesitated, pride and weariness tugging at him. He didn't like outsiders poking into his business, especially strangers. But something in Lena's expression, professional, yes, but touched with quiet empathy, made him nod. "He's in the stall." "Don't expect much inside." Whisper stiffened the instant they entered. His ears flicked, nostrils widening as he shuffled back until his rump nearly pressed the boards. Lena stopped 3 paces from the gate, her body relaxed, her gaze low. She crouched slightly, speaking in a soft cadence, as if addressing not just the horse, but the air itself. "He's been through rough hands," she murmured. "You can see it in the way he braces before anything even happens." Evan frowned, following her eyes. "He's just skittish." "Storm rattled him last night." Lena shook her head gently. "Skittish is one thing. This is memory. He's waiting for pain." She slid a hand along the stall gate, moving slow. The horse shifted, but didn't bolt. Lena tilted her head toward the scar near Whisper's mouth. You see that? That's from a twisted bit. Someone yanked him hard, over and over. He learned the world hurts. Evan's stomach tightened. He had noticed the mark, but dismissed it as old wear. Hearing it named for what it was unsettled him. So what do I do? Just let him stand there? For now, you let him decide the distance, Lena replied. No sudden moves, no shouting, no forcing, but every second he doesn't run is a second he's learning you aren't the same as whoever did this. Evan exhaled, resting an arm on the stall door. Whisper's sides rose and fell, still taut, but his ears angled slightly forward, listening. Lena knelt to examine the horse's legs, keeping her body turned sideways, non-threatening. He's thin, but not sick. What he needs most isn't medicine, it's patience. You've taken on more than you realize. Evan rubbed the back of his neck, weary of hearing what he already knew. The debt hanging over the ranch, the whispers around town. He didn't need reminding. Yet looking at the gray horse, he felt a stubbornness coil inside him. He wasn't ready to give in. Not yet. When Lena stood, she dusted her hands. I'll come back if you want. But only if you're serious about this. He can heal, but not if you try to break him down further. Evan studied her, then the horse. I don't plan to break him, he said, voice low. I've seen enough broken things. For the first time, Lena's expression softened into a smile, small but genuine. She shouldered her bag, her braid swinging as she walked toward the door. Then maybe you've got a chance. As her truck disappeared down the road, Evan lingered by the stall. Whisper had inched closer to the gate, his breathing calmer, his body less rigid. Evan reached out, stopping just short of the bars, letting the space between them hum with possibility. We'll figure it out, he whispered, words carrying the weight of promise more than certainty. Whisper's ears flicked, as though catching the sound. For the first time, the horse didn't retreat. Instead, he stood, watching, and the silence felt less like distance and more like fragile truce. That night, when the valley quieted under a rising moon, Evan replayed Lena's words. He's waiting for pain. And beneath them, another truth stirred. So was he. Both man and horse, carrying wounds invisible yet sharp. Neither knowing yet whether trust could be built from such brokenness, but both, in their own way, standing on the edge of trying. The next morning, the valley woke under a veil of mist, the mountains smudged into pale silhouettes. Evan rose early, shoulders aching from a night spent half sleeping in the kitchen chair. The memory of Lena's quiet words echoed through him. No sudden moves, no forcing. Let him decide the distance. He carried those instructions into the barn as the first streaks of sunlight touched the roof. Whisper stood at the far side of the stall, his coat still damp from the humid night. When Evan slid the door open, the gelding's head lifted sharply, but he didn't bolt. That, Evan told himself, was progress enough. He left the gate open just wide enough to step inside, but instead of reaching for the rope, he sank slowly onto an overturned bucket. He rested his forearms on his knees, tilted his head down, and simply breathed. At first, the horse pawed the straw, uneasy with the silence. Evan forced himself not to fill the space with words. He matched his breaths to a slow rhythm, in through the nose, out through the mouth, the way he had learned years ago to steady his nerves before climbing into the saddle with his father. Time stretched, broken only by the barn swallows darting in and out through cracks in the rafters. Gradually, Whisper's ears twitched less, his ribs rising and falling in something closer to calm. After nearly 20 minutes, Evan shifted, careful not to stand too tall. He took a single step closer, then stopped. Exhaled, and turned slightly sideways so he wouldn't appear square on. Whisper tensed, but stayed rooted. The lesson was not about touch, Evan realized, but about permission. Each breath was a question, and the horse's stillness was the fragile answer. He tried again later that day in the corral. The clouds had broken, spilling wide sunlight over the fields. Evan led Whisper out with the rope loose, giving him room to circle. The horse tossed his head once, suspicious, but when Evan slowed his stride, the gelding matched it, almost like a dance. Dust lifted under their feet, swirling in lazy spirals. Evan felt something shift inside him, a rhythm older than words, older than memory. When Whisper halted, ears pricked, Evan lowered his gaze, then took a single step back. To his surprise, the horse stepped forward, closing the gap by choice. It was only a foot of ground, but to Evan it felt like a mile crossed. His chest swelled, not with pride, but with the fragile hope that maybe this bargain of $1 had brought him something money couldn't measure. That evening, Lena returned, her truck rattling up the drive. She leaned against the corral fence, watching silently as Evan worked. When Whisper mirrored his step, she raised her brows. "He's starting to listen," she said. Evan wiped the sweat from his brow. "Feels more like I'm the one listening." "That's the point," Lena replied. Her voice carried approval, but also caution. "Keep the distance. Let him come to you. Don't rush it. Trust is like gold glass. You drop it once, it may never be whole again." They stood in silence a moment, the fading sun painting the valley gold. Evan looked at Whisper, the horse's coat shimmering, scar glinting faintly near his mouth. "I don't know if I can fix him," he admitted. "You don't have to fix him," Lena said softly. "You just have to meet him where he is." Later, when the stars pricked through the twilight, Evan sat on the porch steps, listening to the night settle. Whisper shifted in the corral, the sound of his breathing carrying across the still air. Evan closed his eyes, matching his breaths once more, steady and unhurried. For the first time in years, his chest loosened, as though the tightness of grief had made room for something else, something wordless, like the space between man and horse when both finally chose not to run. Saturday morning arrived with the hush of clear skies after days of shifting clouds. Evan had been stacking bales in the loft, sweat soaking through his shirt, when he heard the familiar rumble of a minivan on the gravel drive. He leaned out from the barn door, shading his eyes. The sight of his daughter stepping out, her backpack slung over one small shoulder, her hair flying wild in the breeze, made his chest ache with something heavier than simple relief. "Maya," he called, and she waved, sprinting across the yard with a burst of energy only 9-year-olds carried. Her mother stayed in the driver's seat, engine idling. The air between Evan and his ex-wife was always careful, words exchanged only when necessary. She offered a curt nod before backing down the drive, leaving the girl in her father's care for the weekend. Evan knelt to catch Maya in his arms, the dusty scent of hay and sunshine wrapping around them. "Got something for you," she said breathlessly, unzipping her pack. She pulled out a sheet of paper, edges bent from travel. It showed a horse sketched in crayon, wings sprouting wide and colorful from its shoulders. Across the top, she had scrawled, "Whisper can fly." Evan swallowed. That's for him? Uh-huh. You said he was special. She tilted her chin toward the barn. Can I see him? Evan hesitated. Maya had always been skittish about horses, especially since overhearing too many stories of her grandfather's accident. But her eyes now held a brightness, daring herself against the fear. Evan led her inside. Whisper stood in the corral, head bent to the grass. The moment they entered, his ears flicked, muscles tightening. Maya slowed, clutching the drawing. He's big, she whispered. He won't hurt you, Evan said gently. But you don't have to go closer than you want. Maya walked to the fence, lifted the paper high so the horse could see. The crayon wings gleamed in the sunlight. Whisper's nostrils flared. He took a cautious step forward, then another. His eyes darted, but he didn't spook. Instead, he reached his nose toward the fluttering page, breath stirring the crayon wax. For a fleeting second, he held still, the paper trembling in Maya's small hands. Her face lit with wonder. He's smelling it. Looks like he likes it, Evan said softly, heart thudding. It was the closest Whisper had come to bridging the space without Evan guiding him. Maya taped the drawing to the stall wall that afternoon, her handwriting uneven, but proud. Now he'll remember he has wings, she explained. Evan watched her chatter, as if Whisper were listening. Perhaps he was. The gelding's body no longer quivered at the girl's voice. That night, after Maya had fallen asleep on the couch with a blanket tucked to her chin, Evan stepped back outside. The paper fluttered faintly in the dim light, wings outstretched against the wood. Whisper stood near it, head lowered, his body eased into an unfamiliar calm. Evan leaned on the rail, breathing in the quiet. His daughter had given the horse something Evan hadn't been able to: innocent belief. In her drawing, Whisper wasn't broken or scarred. He was flying. And maybe, just maybe, that vision could anchor them all. Sunday dawned with a clarity that felt almost deliberate, as if the valley itself were offering a stage. The rain from days before had coaxed new shoots of green across the pasture, soft blades that bent under dew. Evan led Whisper out to the corral at first light, his daughter still asleep inside, the drawing she had taped fluttering gently in the barn. He carried no whip, no heavy tack, only a length of rope and the memory of Lena's advice: give space, breathe, and let the horse answer. Whisper stepped into the circle cautiously, hooves leaving damp prints in the soil. His head swung high, searching the horizon for danger, but the air was calm. Evan stood at the center, rope slack in his hand, his shoulders relaxed. He didn't call out, didn't tug. He simply turned his body, inviting movement. At first, the gelding resisted. He paced the rail, ears twitching, tail swishing with nerves. Evan stayed patient, matching his rhythm with breath, each exhale a quiet signal. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Whisper's stride began to follow the curve Evan set. Dust lifted in soft clouds, the sun painting the particles gold. Minutes stretched. Then came the moment. Whisper slowed, his circle shrinking until he stopped altogether, his chest heaving. Instead of turning away, he shifted his head toward Evan, one eye steady, ears forward. Evan lowered his gaze, stepped back, and let the silence hang. Whisper stepped closer, a deliberate choice, and lowered his head until his cheek brushed against Evan's shoulder. The world seemed to still. Evan felt the warmth of the horse's breath against his shirt, the weight of fragile trust pressing into him. His throat tightened, the laughter of the auction crowd fading from memory. In its place bloomed something stronger. Quiet, undeniable connection. Unbeknownst to him, two men from the neighboring ranch had paused along the fence line on their way into town. They had stopped to watch, expecting perhaps a spectacle of failure. Instead, they stood wordless, hats in hand, as the so-called broken horse leaned willingly into the man everyone had mocked. Later, Maya wandered out, rubbing sleep from her eyes. She froze at the sight. Her father standing still as stone, Whisper's head resting against him. Her face broke into a smile, wide and unguarded. "Daddy," she whispered, careful not to break the spell. "He likes you." Evan swallowed past the lump in his throat. "Maybe he trusts me a little," he said. He didn't add that it was the first time in years he felt worthy of that word, trust. The neighbors eventually moved on, but by evening the story was already circulating through town. The broken horse had chosen the man who bought him for a single $1. Evan felt the weight of those whispers pressing in, a strange mix of pride and unease. For trust, this delicate could be lost as quickly as it had been found. That night, under a sky fading into indigo, Evan sat on the porch with Maya curled against him. The image of Whisper's head resting on his shoulder replayed again and again, each time tightening the knot in his chest. For the first time in years, he thought maybe, just maybe, things could change. Yet beneath the hope lay a quiet fear. Hope, like trust, was glass, and both could shatter at the faintest blow. By Monday morning, word had spread across Paradise Valley faster than rain down a gully. At the diner in town, June Whitaker poured coffee and leaned over to whisper, "Did you hear?" That broken horse leaned right on Evan Cole's shoulder. By the time the sheriff stopped in for pie, the story had grown. Some swore the animal bowed to him. Others claimed it followed him around the corral like a loyal dog. Laughter had turned into speculation, and speculation into a curious kind of awe. Evan felt the ripple long before he drove into town. Neighbors he barely spoke to tipped their hats, and strangers watched him with a mixture of intrigue and disbelief. He hated the attention. It didn't feel earned, not yet. Whisper still startled at shadows, still braced at every sudden sound. What had happened in the corral was a fragile thread, not a miracle. Back at the ranch, the pressure grew heavier in quieter ways. A letter from the bank waited in his mailbox, stamped in thick red. Final notice. He read it twice, his hands tightening until the paper wrinkled. The deadline loomed only weeks away, and there was no money left in the reserve. The ranch was slipping from his grasp even as hope sparked in the corral. That afternoon, when he tried leading Whisper through the pasture, the gelding balked at the flap of a tarp left by the fence. He reared, snorting, eyes white. Evan's first instinct was to grab hard, to force control, but Lena's warning echoed. Trust is glass. He loosened the rope, breathed steady, and waited. Minutes passed before Whisper's trembling slowed enough for him to take a single step forward. The progress felt like inches on a mile-long road. Still, the valley had already decided. When Evan stopped by the feed store, a rancher clapped him on the back. "You've got yourself a wonder horse there, Cole. Folks say you could show him off at the fair next month, make back some of that debt." Evan forced a thin smile. He's not ready. But the idea burrowed under his skin. Could the horse be more than just a chance at redemption? Could he be the salvation of the ranch itself? Evan hated himself for thinking it, yet the numbers on the bank notice burned into his mind each night. At supper, Maya sensed the weight he carried. She sat across the table, swinging her feet, watching him push food around his plate. "Daddy," she said carefully, "do you think people only like Whisper because he's special? Or because they didn't think he could be?" Evan looked at her, startled by the clarity in her young voice. "Maybe both," he admitted. "But we can't let their stories decide ours." That night, as the wind rattled the barn boards, Evan lay awake, listening to Whisper shift in the stall. The rumors had lifted him in the eyes of the valley, but they also bound him tighter to expectations he wasn't sure he could meet. He whispered into the darkness, voice low enough that only the horse might hear. "I don't need you to be a miracle. I just need you to stay." The horse exhaled softly, a sound almost like answer. Evan closed his eyes, holding on to that thin thread against the weight of deadlines and gossip pressing down like an approaching storm. The bell above June Whitaker's store jingled as Evan stepped inside for feed and salt blocks. Conversations hushed for a moment, then resumed in lowered tones. He'd grown used to the glances, half curious, half calculating. But this time he noticed a stranger at the counter. A broad man with slicked back hair and a leather jacket too polished for Montana dust, leaned casually, flipping a silver coin over his knuckles. His eyes, sharp and restless, settled on Evan with a kind of recognition that made the back of Evan's neck prickle. "You're the fellow with that gray horse," the man said, his voice carrying a desert drawl. "Goes by Whisper now, right?" Evan froze with the receipt in his hand. "That's his name." The man smiled without warmth. "Name don't change what he is. I know that horse. Had him down in Nevada for trail rides. Called him Ghost back then, on account of how he'd spook at his own shadow." He laughed, the sound brittle. "Cost me a fortune in vet bills when he busted a wagon shaft. Damn near trampled a tourist. Mean streak in him, I'd say Evan bristled, but kept his tone even. Doesn't sound like the same horse." "Oh, it's him." The man tapped the counter with a finger. "Scar on his mouth gives him away. I sold him off cheap when he got useless. Never thought I'd see him in Montana. Truth is, I still got papers." The words dropped like stones. Evan's chest tightened. Ownership papers meant leverage, and leverage could take Whisper away. Later, back at the ranch, Lena examined the scar with careful fingers. "He's telling the truth," she admitted reluctantly. "This kind of mark doesn't come from one mistake. It's years of rough handling, and if he really does have papers—" She trailed off, her expression troubled. Evan stood by the stall, fists clenched. Whisper shifted restlessly, picking up on his tension. "I'm not letting him go back," Evan said, more to himself than to Lena. "Not after what I've seen in him." "You may not have a choice if he presses it legally," Lena warned. "But you can fight it, and, more important, you can give Whisper proof every day that he's not what that man says he is." That evening, the stranger from Nevada pulled his truck up by the gate, engine idling loud against the quiet valley. Evan stepped out onto the porch, Maya watching from behind the screen door. The man leaned out the window, sunglasses catching the last of the sun. "I'll be back with the papers," he called. "Might be worth more to me now that folks think he's some miracle horse." "Don't get too attached." Dust spun up as the truck roared away. Whisper, grazing near the barn, tossed his head and whinnied sharply, eyes wide. Evan moved toward him, stroking the air near his shoulder, whispering steady. It took long minutes for the horse's breathing to ease. That night, Evan sat with Maya's drawing still taped to the stall wall, staring at the bright wings. "You're not Ghost," he murmured into the darkness. "You're Whisper." And you're mine, no matter what he says. The horse shifted, stepping closer, his breath stirring the paper wings. In that small gesture, Evan found the strength to believe that some truths lived deeper than ink on any set of papers. The next week opened with a stretch of dry skies and long days in the pasture. Evan rose before dawn to work Whisper through quiet exercises, circling, stopping, rewarding calm. Lena came by twice, coaching him with small nods, and each time the gelding seemed to trust a fraction more. By Thursday, Evan dared to believe they were building something solid. That illusion cracked on Friday afternoon. The neighbor down the road had a farrier out, and the rhythmic clang of hammer on anvil carried across the valley. At first it was faint, hidden under the whir of crickets. Then a sharp strike rang louder, and Whisper's head snapped up, eyes wide, his body stiffened, ears swiveling, breath coming fast. Evan lifted a hand. "Easy, boy." "It's nothing, just a hammer." But the horse had already sunk into old memory. The metallic clink brought him back to whatever cruelty Nevada had imprinted. He bolted across the corral, rope slipping from Evan's fingers. Hooves thundered against the boards, dust exploding into the air. Maya had been sitting on the fence rail, sketchbook in her lap. The sudden panic startled her, and as Whisper lunged, she lost her balance. She tumbled into the dirt, crying out as she landed hard on her side. Evan froze. For a split second, he wasn't in Montana anymore. He was 18 again, watching his father thrown from the saddle, the sickening silence that followed. His muscles locked, heart seizing in his chest. Whisper's frantic circling threw dust over them both. Maya tried to scramble to her feet, coughing. Evan willed himself to move, but his body disobeyed, anchored in fear. His pulse roared in his ears, drowning out everything else. Then Lena's voice cut through the chaos. She had just pulled up in her truck, drawn by the commotion. "Evan! Get her out of there!" The command snapped the hold of memory. Evan lunged forward, scooping Maya into his arms. He rushed her to the fence, setting her gently on the safe side. She coughed, but nodded that she was all right, only bruised. Relief nearly buckled his knees. Inside the corral, Whisper still tore around in blind terror, sweat lathering his neck, whites of his eyes glaring. Evan forced himself to breathe, slow, steady, deliberate. He stepped back into the corral, though every instinct screamed to retreat. He lowered his body, turned sideways, and waited. It took long, agonizing minutes. The hammer blows down the valley had ceased, but the ghost of them still clanged in the horse's mind. Finally, Whisper slowed, sides heaving, until he stood trembling in the far corner. Evan didn't move closer. He simply knelt in the dust, letting his breaths fill the silence. Gradually, the trembling eased, though the distance between them remained. When he finally latched the gate that evening, exhaustion weighed heavier than the summer heat. Maya sat beside him on the porch steps, her elbow scraped, but her eyes dry. "You froze, Daddy," she said quietly. The words pierced more than any injury. Evan couldn't deny it. He had frozen, just as he had the day his father died. Shame hollowed his chest. "I know," he admitted, voice raw. "I'm sorry." She leaned against him anyway, small shoulder pressing into his side. "But you came back." In the barn, Whisper shifted restlessly, still caught between fear and fragile calm. Evan stared out across the valley, the sound of phantom hammers echoing in his mind. The trust they had built felt cracked, as though a single strike had shattered days of work. He wondered if it could be repaired, or if both man and horse were doomed to repeat the same old patterns of fear. The barn smelled of damp earth and sweat-soaked wood. Darkness pressed heavy against the walls, broken only by the dim glow of a lantern that Evan had set on a hook. After the chaos of the afternoon, silence seemed both fragile and accusing. Whisper stood in the stall, ribs rising and falling with uneven breaths, while Evan leaned against the gate, his own body still trembling from shame. Maya had gone to bed early, her elbow bandaged, her eyes watching him with worry. She hadn't said more about the moment he froze, but her silence weighed more than words. Evan felt it in the marrow of his bones. That same paralysis that had gripped him years ago, when his father fell. He had sworn never to repeat that helplessness, yet here it was again. Lena arrived after dark. She stepped quietly across the yard, her braid catching the lantern light. "How's your daughter?" she asked, her voice low. "She'll be fine," Evan replied. "Scraped, but tough." His jaw tightened. "I wasn't." Lena studied him. "You froze." "I watched him go down, years ago. My father." The confession slipped out, raw, scraped, from the part of him he never spoke aloud. "The horse bolted. He hit his head on the rocks. I couldn't move. I just stood there. And today..." His throat closed. "It was the same. I thought I was past it, but when Maya fell, I was that boy again." For a long moment, Lena said nothing. She looked at Whisper, still pacing slow circles in the stall. "You're not the only one carrying ghosts," she said finally. "I worked with a bay mare back in Wyoming, sweet as spring grass. But when the funding was cut, we couldn't keep her. They sold her off at auction. I never found out where she went. I still dream of her screaming when they loaded her." Her voice cracked, but she steadied it. "We all have our breaks. Doesn't mean we can't mend." Evan dropped onto a bale of straw, elbows on his knees, head in his hands. The lantern flickered. "What if I'm not enough for him? What if he needs more than I can give?" Lena sat beside him, her hand brushing straw from her jeans. "You don't have to be everything. You just have to stay. That's what horses learn from us. Not tricks, not strength, just whether we leave or not." Something loosened in his chest. He rose slowly, pushing open the stall door. Whisper tensed, but Evan didn't reach for the rope. Instead, he lowered himself onto the straw, cross-legged, a respectful distance away. The horse shifted, ears flicking, uncertain. Evan spoke softly, not to command, but to confess. "I can't promise I won't fail again. I can't promise I'm stronger than fear, but I promise I won't walk away from you. Not tonight, not tomorrow." The barn filled with silence, thick and waiting. Whisper snorted, pawed the straw, and for a long time he kept his distance. Then, as the lantern guttered low, the gelding stepped closer. He lowered his head slowly until his forehead touched Evan's chest. Not hard, but firm enough that Evan felt the weight of it sink into him. Tears burned his eyes. He pressed a trembling hand to the horse's neck, fingers barely grazing the warm coat. No force, no rope, only choice. Whisper had given it freely. Lena exhaled softly, as if afraid to disturb the moment. "See?" she murmured. "Not broken. Just waiting." The lantern died, leaving them in darkness, the sounds of breathing, man and horse, steadying together. For the first time in years, Evan felt the grip of the past loosen. He had not run, and neither had Whisper. They were both still there, in the straw, sharing the quiet truth of survival. The first storms of autumn rolled in on a Sunday, gray clouds swelling over the valley until the mountains disappeared behind a curtain of rain. The fields turned slick and dark, the scent of wet sage drifting through every open window. Evan pulled his jacket tight as he crossed the yard, boots sinking into mud. But for once the weather didn't carry dread. Whisper stood near the fence, ears pricked, watching him come with an expression that was less panic and more curiosity. For weeks, Evan had kept his promise. No rope unless necessary, no sudden hands, only presence. He would sit for hours on the porch or in the corral, reading the paper or mending tack, while Whisper grazed nearby. Slowly, the horse had begun to seek him out, not for food, but for company. Now, as the rain came heavy, Whisper stepped toward him without hesitation, and Evan felt the change like the first hint of dawn after a long night. Maya ran out with her hood up, giggling as the storm plastered her hair to her cheeks. She darted across puddles until she reached the fence. Whisper turned his head toward her, and instead of shying, nudged the rail with his nose. Maya grinned and stretched out her small hand, palm open. The horse lowered his head, lips brushing her fingers. She squealed with delight, then covered her mouth, afraid she'd scared him. But Whisper stayed, patient, rain sliding down his silver coat. Evan caught Lena watching from under the barn eave, her arms folded, her smile faint, but real. "He's letting her in," she said. "He's letting both of us in," Evan answered. He couldn't hide the pride in his voice. For the first time in years, the ranch didn't feel like a place of ghosts. It felt alive again. The days that followed carried that same rhythm of hope. Evan walked Whisper through puddles, letting the rain drum on the tin roof while they stood together inside the barn. Each time the thunder rolled, the horse startled less. The memory of the hammer still haunted him, but it no longer owned him. When Evan touched his neck now, Whisper leaned into the hand instead of away. Word reached town again. June Whitaker stopped Evan in the store, her eyes bright. "Folks are saying it's a blessing, what you've done. Maybe you'll bring him to the autumn fair? Show people how far he's come?" Evan shook his head at first. The idea of parading Whisper under lights and noise unsettled him. But the thought lingered. The bank's final notice still sat folded in his jacket pocket, the deadline creeping closer. Perhaps, if people saw the truth with their own eyes, they would understand that Whisper wasn't just a miracle story. He was proof that something broken could live again. That night, as rain tapped softly against the roof, Evan sat at the table with Maya. She was coloring another picture, this one of 3 figures: a man, a little girl, and a horse standing beneath a bright rainbow. She slid it across to him shyly. "It's us," she said. Evan traced the crayon lines with his finger. His throat tightened, but he managed a smile. "Looks about right." Outside, Whisper blew softly from his stall, the sound mingling with the rain. Evan leaned back in his chair, letting the hope settle into him like warmth from a long-delayed fire. The storm no longer felt like a threat. It felt like cleansing. For the first time, he believed they might weather what was coming. Not because of luck, not because of money, but because none of them were standing alone anymore. The fairgrounds in Paradise Valley smelled of roasted corn and sawdust, the air crisp with the bite of October. Orange leaves skittered along the gravel paths as families bustled from booth to booth, children tugging balloons, fiddlers sawing out reels on a small stage. It was the kind of day that seemed harmless on the surface, but Evan felt tension twist in his gut as he led Whisper toward the holding pen behind the arena. Maya walked at his side, clutching the strap of her satchel as if it were armor. "He'll be okay, Daddy," she whispered, though her own voice shook. Whisper's ears flicked at every burst of laughter, every clang from the Midway Games. His muscles tensed, but he didn't rear. Weeks of patience had given him a measure of resilience. Still, Evan kept his grip loose, mindful of how easily trust could fracture under noise and strangers. Inside the pen, Lena met them, clipboard in hand, boots already dusted from a morning of checking other animals. "You don't have to do this," she said quietly, eyes searching his. "I know," Evan answered, his jaw set. "But people need to see him for what he is. Not the ghost of Nevada, not the miracle they're whispering about. Just himself." The announcer's voice boomed from the loudspeaker, calling participants to the small exhibition ring. One by one, handlers led out horses that pranced, spun, or jumped at the tug of reins. Crowds clapped, cameras flashed. Then came Evan's name. A pause of curiosity before a ripple of murmurs. The farmer with the dollar horse. Evan stepped into the ring with Whisper. No saddle, no show bridle, only the rope halter. The noise swelled, and the gelding froze, eyes wide. Evan exhaled slowly, turning sideways, shoulders relaxed. He let the rope sag. For a moment, the entire arena seemed to hold its breath. Then Evan took a step. Whisper hesitated, then followed. Another step. Another response. The crowd grew quiet, puzzled by the absence of tricks. Evan stopped in the center, dropped the rope entirely, and crouched low. The horse blinked, ears twitching, then walked forward of his own accord. He lowered his head until it touched Evan's shoulder, just as he had in the circle of green grass weeks before. The silence in the stands deepened. No laughter, no jeers, only stillness, as if the entire fairground recognized the fragile miracle unfolding. Evan lifted a hand and brushed Whisper's neck lightly. "This is him," he said, voice carrying just enough. Not broken. Just waiting to be heard, Maya pressed against the fence, eyes shining. Lena swallowed hard, her clipboard forgotten. Even Sheriff Tom, standing at the back with arms crossed, shifted uncomfortably, a flicker of something like pride softening his stern face. When Evan finally led Whisper out, applause erupted. It wasn't wild or raucous, but it was steady, genuine. Evan felt heat rise behind his eyes. For the first time, the valley wasn't laughing at him. They were listening. Back at the pen, Maya threw her arms around Whisper's neck, her cheek pressed to his damp coat. The gelding stood still, accepting the embrace. Evan rested his hand on his daughter's back, the noise of the fair fading behind them. Hope burned brighter than fear that night, though he knew the man from Nevada hadn't vanished, and the bank's deadline still loomed. But as lanterns lit across the fairground and music drifted over the fields, Evan allowed himself to believe that trust, once earned, could stand before any storm. The applause from the fair still lingered in Evan's memory days later, like an echo he wasn't sure belonged to him. For the first time in years, he had walked through town without hearing the snickers behind his back. But hope was fragile, and it didn't take long for it to be tested. Late one afternoon, dust swirled up the drive as a dark pickup rolled to a stop at the ranch gate. Evan's stomach tightened the moment he saw the Nevada plates. The man from the feed store stepped out, sunglasses glinting, a folder of papers tucked under one arm. His smirk told Evan this wasn't a courtesy call. "Afternoon," the man drawled, resting his boots on the gate rail. "I told you I'd be back." Brought proof this time. He slapped the folder against the metal with a hollow thud. "Bill of sale, ownership papers. That horse still belongs to me." Whisper, grazing nearby, lifted his head sharply, ears flicking back. He sensed the tension, muscles bunching beneath his coat. Evan laid a calming hand on the rope halter, though his own pulse hammered. Before he could answer, Sheriff Tom's truck rumbled up the lane. The sheriff stepped out slowly, hat pulled low, eyes fixed on the man with the folder. "You're a long way from Nevada," he said. "Just here for what's mine," the man replied, holding up the papers. Tom took them, flipping through with a frown. His silence stretched, heavy with unspoken history. Evan knew Tom carried guilt from his father's accident, guilt that made his judgment cautious. But finally the sheriff closed the folder and said, "Funny thing, these signatures don't line up. Looks like you doctored yourself some leverage." The man bristled. "You calling me a liar?" Lena's voice cut in. She had arrived moments before, summoned by Evan's tense call. She stepped forward, clipboard in hand, eyes steady. "I checked with the rescue registry. This horse passed through 3 hands after Nevada, each sale murky, but none legally binding. You abandoned him the day you sold him for scrap." The man's jaw worked, anger flashing. "You don't know the business." "I know cruelty when I see it," Lena said, her tone sharp as glass. The standoff thickened until June Whitaker's voice drifted from behind the fence. She had walked up quietly, basket of supplies in hand. "Whole town saw what that horse chose at the fair," she said simply. "Papers or no, he's not yours anymore." Neighbors had gathered too, drawn by the sight of trucks at Evan's gate. Their presence shifted the weight of the moment. Whispers of support swelled, quiet but steady, like the murmur of a river after a storm. The man from Nevada glared at the circle forming around him. For the first time, his confidence wavered. He spat into the dirt, shoved the papers back into his folder, and climbed into his truck. "This isn't over," he snarled before slamming the door. Dust rose as he roared away, but the sound felt more like retreat than threat. Evan exhaled slowly, shoulders sagging. Whisper pressed his head against Evan's arm, as if anchoring him. Sheriff Tom studied the ground a long moment before meeting Evan's eyes. "I should have stepped in years ago, when things first went wrong with your dad. I didn't. But I'm here now." His voice carried the weight of old regret, and maybe, finally, a measure of redemption. That evening, as the valley dimmed into twilight, Evan stood in the barn with Lena and Maya. The drawing with wings still fluttered on the wall, and Whisper stood beneath it, calm and steady. "Looks like the past finally came knocking," Lena said quietly. "And walked away empty," Evan answered, his hand resting on the horse's scarred muzzle. He wasn't naive enough to think battles were done. There was still the bank, still his own doubts. But for the first time, the ghosts of yesterday no longer held the deed to his future. The autumn sun hung low, casting long amber shadows across the fairground as Evan tightened the rope halter around Whisper's head. The invitation had come after the small exhibition weeks before. Another showcase, this time larger, the centerpiece of the season's closing festival. Word had spread beyond the valley. People from neighboring counties arrived, curious to see the farmer and the $1 horse. Maya clung to Evan's hand as they walked toward the ring. "Do we have to make him do tricks?" she asked, her voice small. Evan shook his head. "We don't make him do anything. We let him show them who he is." The stands buzzed with expectation. Spectators leaned forward, eager for a spectacle. A horse rearing on command, galloping in circles, bowing to applause. The announcer's booming voice promised a demonstration of trust and goal transformation. But Evan's chest tightened at the words. Trust wasn't theater, and transformation wasn't for show. When they entered the ring, Whisper stiffened under the noise, ears swiveling. Evan steadied his breathing, moving slow, letting the rope slack. Instead of driving him through rehearsed maneuvers, Evan led him to the center and then unclipped the line. Gasps rippled through the crowd. No bridle, no saddle, no safety net. Evan crouched low, shoulders soft, hands open. He spoke just loud enough for Whisper to hear. "It's your choice." For a heartbeat, the gelding stood frozen, the weight of hundreds of eyes pressing in. Then, slowly, he stepped forward. First one stride, then another, until his muzzle brushed against Evan's chest. Evan closed his eyes, pressing a hand lightly against the horse's neck. Nothing fancy, nothing dramatic, just presence. He turned toward the stands. This horse isn't here to perform. He isn't here to prove anyone wrong or right. He's here because he chose to stay. That's enough. His words echoed in the hush. Then he did something no one expected. Evan beckoned a handful of children lingering at the rail, kids who had been clutching the fence in fear moments before. "If you're scared of horses," he said gently, "come touch him." Just a hand on his shoulder. He won't hurt you. Hesitant, one boy climbed through the gate, then another. Whisper flicked an ear, but didn't move. The children laid small palms against his coat, eyes wide with awe. Laughter bubbled softly from their throats, not mocking but amazed. Soon others joined, a half-circle of little hands pressed to the scarred gray. The crowd erupted, not in raucous cheering, but in a wave of applause that swelled like a tide. Sheriff Tom stood at the back, his face unreadable. But when Evan glanced up, the sheriff tipped his hat. Lena wiped a tear quickly, pretending it was dust. Evan looked down at Maya, who had stepped forward with the others, her cheek resting against Whisper's shoulder. Her drawing of wings seemed to come alive in that moment, not on paper but in the way the horse carried all their fear and replaced it with calm. When the applause finally faded, Evan clipped the rope loosely and led Whisper from the ring. There were no bows, no rearing silhouettes against the sunset, only quiet dignity. And somehow, that was more powerful than any spectacle. Back behind the barns, Evan leaned his forehead against Whisper's, feeling the heat of breath between them. "You did good," he whispered. "Better than any trick." Whisper blew softly, as if answering in kind. For the first time, Evan understood. What they had built wasn't for sale, wasn't for rumor, wasn't for Nevada papers or bank notices. It was theirs alone, and it needed no performance. Winter came quietly to Paradise Valley, the first snow falling in delicate veils that softened the lines of the fences and dusted the ridges of the barn roof. The fields stretched white and unbroken, a vast canvas beneath the wide Montana sky. Evan stood at the porch rail, his breath rising in clouds, watching Maya tug on her mittens with clumsy determination. Whisper waited by the gate, his gray coat blending almost seamlessly with the snow, steam curling from his nostrils. The bank deadline had come and gone, but not without surprise. After the fair, neighbors had gathered at June Whitaker's store, passing a coffee can around, pressing folded bills and crumpled checks inside. Sheriff Tom had driven the collection to the bank himself. Combined with Evan's meager savings, it was enough to earn a reprieve. The ranch was safe, for now. It wasn't wealth, but it was time, and time felt like a miracle. Evan walked with Maya across the frosted yard. She climbed carefully onto Whisper's back. No saddle, just a thick blanket beneath her. Evan held the rope, but loosely, more as reassurance than control. Maya's laughter rang out, bright against the muted hush of snow, as the horse stepped slowly forward. The valley stretched around them in silence, only the crunch of hooves breaking the stillness. Whisper moved with steady grace, no trace of the frantic ghost from Nevada. His ears flicked back toward Maya's giggles, then forward again, calm and sure. Evan matched his breath to the horse's rhythm. For the first time since his father's fall, the memory didn't bring him to his knees. Instead, it felt like a thread finally tied off. Not forgotten, but no longer festering. The fear that once paralyzed him had loosened its grip. He had faced it, and he had stayed. They paused at the crest of the pasture. Snow stretched out before them, unmarked but for their trail. 2 sets of boot prints and a line of hoof prints side by side. Evan lifted Maya down, and the 3 of them, man, child, and horse, stood together, the cold air stinging their cheeks. Whisper lowered his head, pressing his muzzle against Evan's chest, then nudged Maya's shoulder gently, as though including her in the bond. Maya slipped her mitten off and touched the scarred corner of Whisper's mouth. "You're not broken," she whispered. "You're ours." The words sank deep, warming Evan more than the thick coat on his back. He wrapped an arm around his daughter, his other hand resting against the horse's neck. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like the valley was watching, judging, or waiting for him to fail. It felt like the valley itself had grown quiet in respect, letting them breathe. As the wind shifted, Evan tipped his face toward the pale sun, exhaling a long, steady breath that rose to join Whisper's plume in the cold air. 2 breaths mingled, dissolving into the sky. A promise written not in papers, not in rumor, but in the simple act of staying together against the winter. And in that silence, with snow stretching endless and white around them, the farmer who had once been mocked and the horse once discarded for a single $1 stood unbroken, leaving the whole valley speechless. And now, after all the pain and silence, Evan and Whisper finally stood unbroken, together. If this story touched your heart, drop a simple 0 or 1 in the comments, so we know you're still with us. Don't forget to subscribe, because there are more true, soul-stirring journeys of people and animals waiting for you in the next stories.